Okay.
Hey everybody, my name's Naomi Stonier and I am a life coach for marriage, and I am so happy to be talking to Robyn Spens, who is a boundaries expert. And I'm going to ask Robyn to introduce herself in a minute. But first of all, I just want to frame what we're going to be talking about. And that is what I do in my marriage coaching is I teach you to give what it is you want to receive. Okay, that's the golden rule in marriage coaching. But the common objection or fear that comes up to that is, oh, so you mean I got to run around doing everything for everybody? I've just got to say yes to everything. That's the fear that comes up. But Robyn and I both know that when you are compassionate and you are giving what it is that you feel that you're lacking, it's actually a really powerful place to be. And Robyn is our boundaries expert, and I would love you, Robyn, to help me unpack that common objection and fear.
Yeah, I would love to do that. And so just to introduce a little bit about me, my name is Robyn Spens. I'm a therapist and a coach, and my focus is boundaries. And yeah, I'm the founder of the Boundary Club.
Thanks for that, Robyn. So tell me, help me with this common objection fear that all my clients have.
Yeah, that's so interesting. But I think what interests me is like, do your clients actually know what a boundary is? Like, where is their starting point?
I would love that to be our starting point, because yeah, I think that's a word that gets chucked around. What does it even mean? Please clarify it for us.
Yeah, it does get chucked around a bit. So, like a boundary, I think of it as sort of a demarcation line that defines how you are as an individual and how you will interact with others. Like boundaries define like what's you, like your body, your feelings, your responsibility, your property. Boundaries like differentiate you from me, put very simply. And a boundary makes it clear like you're this unique, autonomous person, not an extension of someone else, like your parents or an extension of your partner. It's getting clear about who you are, what's important to you, and what defines your identity, and then what you're responsible for.
Yeah. So what stands out to me there is getting clear on who you are. And, you know, the golden, one of the main places we work in life coaching for marriage is, what do you want and why do you want it? And to answer that question, you have to understand who you are. And so that is a really useful explanation of boundaries, and also an explanation of why we find them so difficult.
Yeah.
Because we
So,
don't answer these questions, do we?
no, we don't. And getting clear about what do I need in this marriage? What are my responsibilities in this partnership? And getting really clear about your needs. But then the other piece is then how we communicate that, because understanding what you need is fantastic and getting clear about your responsibilities, but it's important and essential that we communicate to other people how we wish to be treated. And that goes into your point around what you give is what you can expect to receive. So it's understanding that, but it's essential to let people know what it is I want and how I wish to be treated. Because when we leave it to people to kind of figure it out, then we end up frustrated, exhausted, feeling mistreated. And people are mind readers. It's our responsibility to articulate how we want to be treated, especially in a marriage or a partnership.
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? How we wish to be treated, and it's how you communicate that. Because what I am teaching people and coaching people on is how you communicate determines whether your message lands or not. So, giving what it is you want to receive, so giving the boundary is how you receive the boundary as well. And so, I mean, you and I talked before the call about compassion. I talk about shaping people with love, I talk about assuming positive intent and having compassion and having a loving boundary. And I would love, and the amazing thing that we discover is that a loving boundary is the strongest boundary. And so you and I have talked a lot about a hard boundary and a soft boundary. And your explanation of that for me was just mind blowing. And I would love you to talk to us about that.
Yeah. So I want to pick up something you said. I encourage people to work to set boundaries from a place of kindness, clarity, and to do that assertively, but with loads of compassion, right? So in my experience, compassionate people ask for what they need, but they also say no when they need to, and yes when they mean it. And that's due to the compassion, right? Setting a boundary is compassionate. And because of their boundaries, they don't sit in that resentment. And so I want to just quote Brene Brown a little bit, because one of the things she says is people with boundaries are the most compassionate people. You are being kind when you tell others how you wish to be treated. And I think boundaries are not ultimatums, they're not threats. What we're articulating is how we wish to be treated, but in a kind, firm, assertive way. So there are a couple of kinds of boundaries, right? There are what we call firm boundaries. They're what I call loose, watery boundaries. And then they're what I call healthy boundaries. And I think firm boundaries are like you put a wall up behind yourself and then you threaten people from that wall. Like, if you don't do this, I'm going to cut you off. Well, that's not a boundary, that's a threat. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of setting yourself up, especially in a marriage, for your boundaries not to be respected, but you're cutting people off from that space of communicating, which is so important when you're actually asking someone to respect your boundaries. Boundaries are flexible, right? They have to be, especially in a marriage. So I think knowing what a boundary is, it's important to know what boundaries aren't.
Yeah, this is, setting a bound. The most compassionate people are set boundaries, because when you have a boundary and you look after yourself, you're able to be really compassionate, aren't you? Yeah. So that is so interesting to me. And then also the trust element, you have to be able to trust yourself and be able to, a soft boundary, a flexible boundary is someone who trusts themselves. A hard boundary is someone who has to use anger to put in a boundary, and then that turns into a threat or an ultimatum. And as someone who trusts and looks after themselves is able to put a soft, compassionate boundary in. This is just so interesting for me, because I talk all the time about if your message is not being received, you've got to get curious about how you're communicating. So if you're communicating in the emotions of shame, blame, and guilt, your message will be resisted. So if you're putting in a boundary through sort of anger or shaming or guilting someone, it's going to be a really hard, tough ultimatum, threat, and boundary, and then that's going to get resisted. Or, you're going to go to war, aren't you? And that person's going to try and break that boundary. But if you're a compassionate, confident, and you're in trust of yourself, then the boundary is oftentimes, what I find so amazing, it's not even questioned.
No, that's an interesting. So there are a couple of things there. Like just distinguishing between what I would call a watery boundary, where, you say something, but you don't mean it, and a healthy boundary, I think, is the best one. But, let's talk about that thing of setting boundaries from anger and guilt. I think that's so important too, because guilt is this feeling that you've done something wrong, right? So when you feel guilt about setting boundaries, it's because you think you don't have the right to protect yourself. You don't have a right to that boundary, but we all do. We have a right to set boundaries. Boundaries aren't mean. Boundaries aren't demands or ultimatums. Boundaries aren't selfish.
Well, I would love to hear what you thought about this one. I work a lot with people who assume responsibility. They do everything and they assume responsibility. Like it's not a conscious experience. They have just learned to do everything and assume responsibility for everything. So for them, a boundary is very guilty because they're just in this like, I've got to do everything for everybody. If I say no, I'm not safe, you're not safe, I should be doing this for you.
And this is maybe something they mirrored as children.
Yeah.
Taking that responsibility. And it's teaching them to take responsibility for themselves. You want to teach someone like that. I work with a lot of people like that who want to take responsibility for everything, especially like their teenage children or their adult children.
Right.
What they're not doing is allowing them to take responsibility for themselves. So it's like you can be responsive, but you don't have to take responsibility. And there's a difference between the two. Like I can be lovingly and compassionately responsive to what's happening to you, but I don't have to take responsibility for it. And I leave you the space to take responsibility for it and set your own boundaries. And that is this kind of line that when we learn about boundaries, we learn for ourselves. It's being able to sit in my boundary and not take responsibility and allow you to do it. Because when I allow you to do it, I'm allowing you to grow as a human being.
So it comes back to how we treat ourselves. So when I look after myself and I care for myself and I trust myself, I don't assume responsibility for everybody. And it's how you treat yourself. And when you're compassionate and kind to yourself, then you can be compassionate and kind to others. Saying no is the kindest thing.
Absolutely.
And so it all comes back to, you've got to be able to give it to yourself first, and then you can give it to others. So you were talking about that watery, unclear boundary.
Yeah.
And so carry on with that.
Yeah, a lot of times we set those with children or we set those in a marriage.
Right.
Instead of saying no, maybe, possibly I could, but the answer is no. But because you don't want to set a boundary, you kind of leave the door open, which is not kind because you're not being clear.
Yeah.
And so that watery boundary, when you do that over and over again, it becomes an expectation that that's the way you are. And for children, it's like, they run all over you because they see, you said no to the candy, but you're giving in, and, your no is not respected because it doesn't come with the backup. So it's important to have levels of boundaries in terms of, learning the language of how to set a boundary. And I think that becomes really important. But a watery boundary sets you up, listen, maybe we're going to go out on Sunday and that you can't go out with that friend, or you don't want to do this activity with your partner. Just say no. This time I can't, but I'd love to do it another time. You're being honest, you're being clear, and you're being compassionate because it allows the other person to get on with what they want to do. But when we hold them in this space of maybe, and we know the answer is no, that's not being clear, that's not being kind.
Yes.
And that's not setting a boundary.
And also there's an expectation with the watery boundary. It's too uncomfortable to set it, so you're in this muddy gray area hoping that they will say okay, no. You're hoping that they will set the boundary, and then when they don't pick up on it because the message isn't clear, we blame.
We blame, and then there becomes this situation where there is, usually a lack of communication because the boundary is not clear. Then we blame, and we sometimes become the victim. You should have, and aren't mind readers. We need to hear.
And so what's the solution? So when we're doing all of this, which is just so normal because, the brain doesn't know the difference between real and imaginary danger. The emotions around setting a boundary are terrifying for our brain. This is scary. It's uncomfortable. What's the solution? Help us.
So, okay, boundaries. A lot of people think boundaries create distance in the marriage. I mean, this is just not true. And I think boundaries build a strong connection, right? So I think they make relationships easier. And I think if that statement is kind of confusing, that boundaries make relationships easier, think about what it's like when other people set boundaries with you. Do you appreciate when your boss sets clear expectations and tells you specifically what they expect? Yes, because they're being clear and you know what needs to be done. Well, this holds the same weight in intimate relationships. When we are clear around our expectations, then people know what's expected of them, and then they can say yes or no.
Yeah.
Children behave better when parents are clear about boundaries. So it's learning how to, firstly, decide what you need, communicate and articulate that boundary, implement it, and then give people time to adjust, right? And it's also about having that correct language about setting a boundary. That becomes really important as well.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it comes back to the emotion we set them in, doesn't it? If we're doing that hard, threaten, ultimatum, because we're scared, and when we're scared we go to anger. So it's like, because it's scary to set the boundary, we have to get angry to set it, and that will create the distance, won't it? So it's all about the emotion that we set the boundary in. But what I also hear you saying is have the ability to have an honest conversation, because if you set the boundary, then you can have an honest conversation. And also being okay. This is what I coach a lot on, being okay with your loved one not being okay. Can you be okay with them not being okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautifully said, because there is this space where people are going to push back because you're setting new things. Give them time to adjust. Or then, it's working with the pushback. I work with my clients and we practice the pushback. We practice that feeling of being okay with other people not being okay with what you've asked, and then the other part of that too is how are we dealing with boundaries when they're set with us? Like when we can get our head around that equation, it makes it easier for us to accept other people's boundaries, because boundaries are both ways.
Yes.
The more we set them, the more people set them with us. But that's great because then we all know where we're at.
It's so interesting because boundaries became a lot easier for me in marriage when I learned to be okay in myself. And it comes right back to our discussion right at the start of understanding yourself. What do you want? Why do you want it? I did the work. When you boundaries get lost in marriage, when we are looking to the marriage to meet our needs. So we put a lot of pressure on the marriage. I need you to make me feel safe and secure. I need you to make me feel happy and alive. And then we put pressure, and boundaries get lost in that. So learning to meet my own needs and be okay in myself meant I was okay when my husband said, no, I don't want to do that with you today. But before, when I needed him to meet my needs, I then had to put a lot of pressure on him to spend time with me or do what it was I wanted to do so I could feel okay, so I could meet the need. And so, yeah, boundaries were not great then. And now I know how to be okay in myself. The boundaries are very neutral now. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. Either me or my husband can say to the other person, hey, I'm not feeling good right now. I'm not feeling good today. Like, I don't feel well, or this problem happened and I'm not in a good space. And just letting you know, if you keep talking to me about that shelf that needs to be putting up, I might snap at you because I'm not in a good space. So it's like this really neutral, very soft boundary. Hey, just letting you know, I'm not okay.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that because, not having, I think it goes back to also how each person in the marriage communicates how the agreements they want to set at the beginning. Like when I say yes, don't question again, because I really mean yes. You can trust that that's what I mean. You know, it's
Oh,
getting
I love
clear
that.
about how what is the dialogue here? Like, we're together. How do we want to communicate with each other? You know, what are the boundaries around our responsibilities and our communication style? So, like, when I say yes, you can trust that I mean that. You don't have to worry. You don't have to stress that I'm saying it from another place, because we have that open line of communication and we've set that as a boundary. And I think when we start to acknowledge and accept how boundaries in terms of our communication style in a marriage, it makes it so much easier. It decreases misunderstandings, and it creates boundaries, create space for clear communication, which is what we want in a marriage, right?
And I think not knowing that a boundary needs to be communicated is a massive issue. So you talked about people are not mind readers. And so I think this would be a really good rule of thumb for us in our relationships. The fact, because I always help people go to the facts, because the brain loves to create
Yeah,
stories, especially in
certainly
marriage.
does.
Oh, yeah. So the facts are that people are not mind readers. So if people are not mind readers, that means you have to communicate your boundaries.
Yeah.
So
And
so please talk. I would love you to talk to that.
yeah, it's a big one. The hardest thing for people is to actually communicate a boundary. And because they have this their mind is running away with, you know, how the boundary is going to land, and boundaries are mean, and boundaries are all of these things. But boundaries are love, boundaries are compassionate. And if we think about it through that lens,
Wow, I love that.
then it becomes easier to articulate a boundary, right?
I love
So
that.
articulating a boundary doesn't have to be this thing. You know, it's like,
Right.
sorry, I can't do that right now, but I'd love to do it later if that is your truth.
Yeah.
Or, you know, I'm coming around for dinner tonight and I know you've got this beautiful white wine, but I'm not going to be drinking. So I'm just letting you know ahead of time. Is that all right?
Oh, love that. It's exactly why my husband and I have learned to say, hey, I'm not in a good space right now, because I love him so much. I don't want to snap at him.
Yeah, it's like,
It's
hey,
coming from a loving
I've got
place.
20 today. What you got? You know, I
Yeah.
need you to have 80 for me, because you know, I'm just having a day. So I need you to hold that other space for me. And when we set those priorities, like this is the way we're going to communicate in our marriage, it makes it so much easier. It's a game changer.
Yeah, yeah. And also what is so important is we all have rules and values and beliefs. I have my set, you have yours. They don't match. In fact, they clash. And so assuming like the reason, oh, it's so reasonable. Like, I shouldn't have to put this boundary in. It's obvious. I
Mm.
shouldn't have to tell them.
Yeah,
I
that
shouldn't have
one.
to communicate it. And so that assumption and expectation about how you should behave.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you handle that?
Yeah, I love that, because assumptions, you know, create problems. Communication clears them up,
Mm,
right? So it's if we don't communicate and we assume, then we're saying that everybody behaves in the same way. We are all unique, autonomous human beings with our needs and unique needs. And if we don't communicate them, people won't know what our expectations are. And what we need to do is know that taking responsibility for communicating our boundaries is not the other person to figure it out. It's for us, each individual, to take responsibility to communicate their boundaries. And taking responsibility means I need to share what I need here.
yeah.
I need to figure it out, and then I need to share it. I can't assume,
Yeah.
like my husband knows me, so he knows what I'm like. And if he knows what I'm like, I'm assuming he knows how to treat me.
Mm.
That's not true.
No, it's never true, is it? So interesting. And just for you to describe This is the most loving thing that you can do. You know, if you love this person, you know, this is what you do for people that you love.
Yes.
Just changes everything, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I love that that's the core. Boundaries are set from love.
Yeah.
Not from resentment, not from frustration. It's like, I want that person closest to me to know how to treat me. What's wrong with that? That's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Like, and I want them to communicate how they want to be treated. And if
God.
all that's coming from compassion, it just opens up that space in between the middle, doesn't it?
Yeah. It makes it
So
feel
much clearer.
a lot easier and a lot more doable, because you and I both know everyone wants to do their best. We just don't know how. So
Well, that brings it to a really good point of how we learn to set boundaries. You know, boundaries, most of us don't learn how to set boundaries. It's just not, it's just not a thing that we learned growing up because they weren't important. So we really have to spend a little time understanding, what a boundary is, what are my needs, but how do I actually articulate and set one? And then, what are the levels? Like someone is pushing the boundary, how do I respond?
Yeah.
And how do I share the consequences of my boundary? So that's kind of going up a level because that's a part of it too. And so, if you continue to do this, I will do this. It's not a threat about what the other person, it's about what I will do. Like for me, a boundary, if people overdrink, I'm not getting in the car with them. Like my husband is like, if you drink too much, I'm taking a cab.
Yeah.
He gets pissed off.
I've got a really simple way of simplifying and normalizing it, and that is the generational bad habits flow down the generations forever. It's a very neutral fact, and so this plays into boundaries. And so understanding why you find it difficult to set a boundary, or why you don't like boundaries, you push against them, it's very simple. It will be determined, like Robyn says, in what you were around. We are sponges soaking this stuff in, and the bad habits flow down the generation forever. No one teaches us how to set boundaries. So it's normal.
No one taught me, I can tell you.
It's normal that we struggle with it. It's a very normal, neutral fact. And you can learn. Simple fact you can learn. And, Robyn, your membership, your program, Boundaries Club, I just love it. Like this specific work, just working on boundaries, it's a game changer. It will change everything.
Yeah. Thank you. I absolutely love doing this work because the core of it has changed people's self-esteem and how they see themselves. And, for a lot of people, it's learning to advocate for yourself. We're just not taught to advocate for ourselves. And advocating for ourselves is not mean.
Yeah.
It's just telling people how to treat you, how you wish to be treated. And also you're learning how to treat other people and respect their boundaries at the same time. So learning to advocate for ourselves creates this space for being able to respect the boundaries for others. Like when they advocate for themselves, we can learn to respectfully disagree.
Yeah.
We can learn to, not to hear no and not take it personally. Because the other person has the right to that.
Yeah.
And it's not
depersonalizing. Everything I do in marriage is about depersonalizing. This is not about good and bad people. This is the skills no one taught us. So, I think, thank goodness our work is in the world, and it was so lovely and useful to chat with you about this. And I'll share this in my group, and we'll put the link to your Boundaries Club in the comments. So thanks so much, Robyn.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's great to talk to you, and I love the work you're doing. So thanks so much for